my interaction with the Orange curriculum in seeing it in action, this is my concern. And some people might think like, Krista, why are you picking on this? Like, why do you have this concern? This is not Christianity. This is just the law. It is not the gospel. The way that they have structured the curriculum is, what do I want a kid to become and where do I want a kid to be? At Orange, we believe the answers to these questions are simple. We want every kid to trust in Jesus in a way that transforms how they love God, themselves, and the world around them. So this is, again, kind of the love God, love yourself, love others type of structure. And my interaction with the Orange curriculum in seeing it in action, this is my concern. And some people might think like, Krista, why are you picking on this? Like, why do you have this concern? This is not Christianity. This is just the law. It is not the gospel. Christianity is both the gospel and the law. And think of law as righteousness. How do I live as in holiness? The gospel is what the Father has done for me. It is the Father's rescue program for me through the Son, empowered by the Holy Spirit. It is that rescue program. And that is embedded in their statement of faith. But what I'm a question mark I have is in so much of their wording, the language focuses on the two great commandments of love God, love your neighbor. And that is an incomplete picture of what our faith is about. Our faith starts with God's rescue program for us. It starts with the gospel. And then our response to that good news is that I worship God and that I love my neighbor. But even loving my neighbor has to be unpacked in what that looks like. And so what I see here is, and what it, like why my antenna are up is, where is the role of the gospel? Because a lot of the language sounds like it's about the practical behaviors, the outcomes. How do I live my life? How do I love my neighbor? And that's where I think that we're going in all of this. But that language, when you see that language, it ought to cause us to ask a question of, is a full and complete picture of our faith being presented, or is it just kind of an aspect of our faith of holy living? Because there is no holy living without the gospel. It has to be rooted and grounded in that. So for me, that's kind of a little red flag as a theologian that I see, is that it seems a little truncated, but I'm going to try to have an open mind about it as we continue to unfold the data. But Natasha, I'm wondering here, maybe this is a good time to lay some groundwork about secular humanism, because I know that that's where your expertise lies. And, if you're already kind of seeing some hints of that in how they're laying things out, and then that can be something in our minds as we continue to investigate the data.
Yeah, I just want to say one thing to piggyback off the discussion about the statement of faith, though. I think something that's really interesting to me about the statement of faith, like Elisa said, I do think it's kind of bare bones, but you don't see robust kind of picture of Christianity throughout the curriculum. I think that's kind of what we're all saying, but I think that starts with the statement of faith. That's not very robust. I think if you read that description, I know we don't have it up on the screen anymore, but if you read that description of God, for example, yes, we've got the three persons of the Trinity there, but there's a very awkward kind of description of God's attributes. So there it is. We only have God is holy, so he is righteous, majestic, and loving. That's all we get. There's nothing in this statement of faith at all about God's justice. There's nothing about the existence of hell. It's very kind of one-sided. And so I think you start to see from this picture that some important things are missing to give it a robustness, even about the nature of God himself. In a lot of statements of faith, you're going to see that more worked out in terms of the various attributes of God. So it's just a little bit strangely worded there. And I think that kind of traces its way through to some other things like what you were saying, Krista. So I just wanted to add on to that I think the fact it is bare bones is exactly what you see throughout the rest of the curriculum. We're missing some key pieces that they just don't emphasize in any place. Yeah. And that comes back to the gospel itself. But going to secular humanism, so to give that a definition, I wanted to pull this definition from the American Humanist Association because this is in their own words. They say that humanism is a progressive philosophy of life that, without theism or other supernatural beliefs, affirms our ability and responsibility to lead ethical lives of personal fulfillment that aspire to the greater good. So, in other words, for most organizations that consider themselves secular humanists, they're saying we don't need there to be any existence of a supernatural being in order to have an ethical system that gives us the ability and responsibility to do good. So they have, for example, a website called Kids Without God. And when you go to that, you can see it's all about we can be good without God. That's the general idea. So in those organizations, they're saying, hey, there's nothing supernatural at all. Let's have an ethical system without it. I'm not claiming in any way, shape, or form that Orange doesn't believe that God exists. Clearly, from everything that we're seeing here, we've been talking about, that's not the case. But what we start to see is that just the secularism in general, when we say secular, meaning that they're really deferring to the authority of the self rather than the authority of God. We see in a lot of the Orange material that it's so much just about the values. It's the ethical system without rooting it in a biblical worldview. So they may not be atheist. Obviously, they're not atheists like an American Humanist Association, but it's the same kind of end result a lot of times where you just end up with an ethical system. Kids be nice, kids be forgiving, kids be good, have some good self-control without tying it back to why it matters. Who gives us all of these rules? Why is there a reason to believe that God even exists? And how has he the grounding for morality in the first place? All of these big questions. And it's kind of interesting to me that I'm taking part of this conversation about Orange because the first time I ever heard about it was several years ago when my kids were in early elementary school. And I realized that I was getting those parent sheets that were sent home. It had never occurred to me to ask about what curriculum the Sunday school uses. My kids were probably like kindergarten or first grade at that time. And I started looking at the sheets when they were coming home. And after a while, I started thinking, gosh, they're not really tying this to Christianity so much. There's a Bible verse on here, but it just seems like they're telling kids, hey, be nice to your friend and share and don't take toys. And there was nothing that was grounding it back to a Christian biblical worldview. And so I talked to the leader at church and I asked, so what is the curriculum that we're using here? And it was Orange. And so I interestingly started to see problems with this because of the parent sheets that got sent home. When I was looking at that and thinking, gee, this doesn't really seem to give more than an ethical system for kids. And then as I continued in ministry and started going and doing speaking events and visiting churches and things like that, I heard over and over from people who were unhappy with Orange for the same reason. And I remember one specific conversation where the leader of the ministry at a very large church was telling me she had just started there. And the first thing that she wanted to do was change the curriculum because the one that they were using was so focused just on the ethical system, the morality, the behavior modification. And she wanted something that was going to actually dig deeper and teach kids about truth, about Christianity specifically. And I asked her what it was, and that was Orange. So I give those stories because I think people have started, and we've all heard from people who have the same considerations and concerns, that so much of it comes down to this kind of humanistic perspective. Yes, they have a Bible verse, or yes, they talk about Jesus in some way, but the end result really becomes so much more about just morality. It's moralistic therapeutic deism, like Elisa was talking about earlier.